June 23rd, 1414. The ground trembles beneath Stirling Castle as 20,000 English knights and men-at-arms thunder across the Scottish lowlands, banners streaming in summer air thick with dust and anticipation. King Edward II rides at their head, determined to crush 6,000 desperate Scots who dare block his path to absolute dominion. But these are not the broken clans fleeing into Highland mist that England expects to scatter. This is the story of how terrain became a weapon, how discipline defeated numbers, and how one day at Bannockburn transformed Scotland from a rebellious province into a nation that could never again be conquered. To understand how 6,000 men could shatter the largest army England had ever brought north, we must first grasp what Edward Plantagenet believed he was marching toward. The King of England commanded the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, knights whose grandfathers had crushed Welsh princes and French lords with equal ease. His war machine moved with the confidence of empire, supplied by the wealth of a kingdom that stretched from the Scottish border to the gates of Paris. But Edward had never fought Robert the Bruce on ground the Spider King had chosen, and the marshy fields around the Bannockburn would teach him that Scotland's new master understood something about warfare that no English king had yet learned. The stories tell of a miraculous victory where Scottish courage overwhelmed English might through divine favor and patriotic fervor. The truth walks on bloodied ground, sustained by months of careful preparation, and a king who understood that survival required transforming desperate men into disciplined soldiers. Robert the Bruce had not always been Scotland's champion. 7 years earlier, he was a fugitive with a price on his head, his family scattered or dead, his supporters hanged from English gibbets. The man who would become the Spider King had learned patience in the hardest school imaginable, hiding in caves and forests while Edward I's armies burned every Scottish stronghold that dared resist. But exile had taught Bruce something that victory never could, that Scotland's independence would not come from charging headlong into English spears, but from making England bleed for every mile of Scottish soil until the cost became unbearable. By 1414, that lesson had borne fruit across 7 years of guerrilla warfare. Bruce and his captains had recaptured every major Scottish fortress save Stirling Castle, using surprise, speed, and intimate knowledge of their homeland to avoid the pitched battles that had destroyed previous Scottish armies. They struck English garrisons at dawn, melted away before reinforcements arrived, and gradually convinced the Scottish people that their cause was not lost. But guerrilla victory had its limits, and those limits had a name: Stirling Castle, the gateway between the Scottish Highlands and the rich lowlands that fed English ambition. The castle's English garrison had agreed to surrender, if not relieved by Midsummer's Day, 1414. This deadline transformed Scotland's war from a series of raids into a direct challenge that no English king could ignore. Edward II faced a choice that would define his reign: march north with overwhelming force to relieve Stirling and crush Bruce's rebellion permanently, or watch English authority in Scotland collapse entirely. The Spider King had woven his web carefully, but now he faced the consequences of his own success. England was coming north with the largest army it had ever assembled, and there would be no retreating into the Highland mist this time. Then the question became whether Bruce's new Scotland could survive its first real test against the military machine that had conquered Wales, humbled France, and never known defeat on British soil. Edward II rides north with more than an army. He commands a military revolution wrapped in steel and silk. 20,000 men march in columns that stretch for miles, their passage marked by the thunder of hooves, the creak of siege engines, and banners that flutter like a field of deadly flowers. At the heart of this war machine ride 2,500 heavy cavalry, knights whose grandfathers broke the Welsh at Orwin Bridge, and whose fathers scattered Scottish armies at Falkirk, with charges that hit like hammered lightning. These are not the mail-clad horsemen of an earlier age. English knights now ride encased in plates of hardened steel, their destriers bred for size and trained to strike with iron-shod hooves. Each knight represents a fortune in equipment, and a lifetime of training armed with lance, sword, and mace, supported by squires and men-at-arms who form a tactical system, perfected through decades of continental warfare. Behind them march Welsh longbowmen whose arrows can punch through mail at 200 paces, Gascon crossbowmen whose bolts can shatter shields, and English infantry armed with pikes and bills sharp enough to gut a charging horse. But numbers tell only part of the story. Edward's host moves with the confidence of inevitable victory, provisioned by the wealth of the richest kingdom in northern Europe, and commanded by veterans who have never known defeat on British soil. The Earl of Gloucester has crushed rebel barons. The Earl of Pembroke has held the Welsh marches against constant raids, and Sir Giles d'Argenton carries a reputation as one of the finest knights in Christendom. They march towards Stirling expecting to sweep aside Bruce's rabble as easily as their predecessors destroyed William Wallace's peasant levies. Yet this very confidence carries the seeds of tactical blindness. English doctrine assumes that heavy cavalry can break any formation through sheer momentum and shock. Their battles against the French have reinforced this belief. Their victories over previous Scottish armies have confirmed it, and their crushing superiority in numbers makes questioning it seem absurd. Why should they adapt their methods when those methods have never failed? The question hanging over the summer roads to Stirling is whether 20,000 men marching toward certain victory have considered what happens when terrain makes their greatest strength into their greatest weakness, and whether an army that has never tasted defeat can recognize disaster when it wears the face of 6,000 desperate Scots who have learned that survival requires fighting in ways no English knight has ever encountered. While Edward's army thunders north towards certain glory, Robert the Bruce studies a map that shows something entirely different, a killing ground disguised as an open field. The Spider King has chosen his battlefield with the patience of a hunter, who knows that the prey's strength can become the trap that destroys it. South of Stirling Castle, where the Roman road crosses the Bannockburn, marshy ground stretches between patches of firm earth like fingers of bog, reaching toward the castle walls. Here is where Bruce will make his stand, not because the ground favors defense, but because it punishes the kind of massed cavalry charge that has made English armies invincible. The Bannockburn winds through terrain that looks solid from a distance, but turns treacherous under the weight of heavy horses. Streams branch and merge through fields that flood with each summer rain, creating a maze of soft ground hidden beneath deceptively green grass. An English knight charging across this terrain will find his destrier's hooves sinking into mud that grips like quicksand, his formation breaking apart as horses stumble and riders crash into the men behind them. But terrain alone cannot defeat 20,000 soldiers. Bruce's true weapon walks on two legs and thinks with a collective mind forged through months of relentless drilling. The Scottish army that assembles south of Stirling bears no resemblance to the feudal levies that English cavalry has shattered in previous campaigns. These men fight in formations called schiltrons, disciplined squares of spearmen trained to move as a single organism, their 12-foot pikes creating walls of steel that can advance, retreat, or wheel as one unified mass. Each schiltron contains roughly 1,500 men arranged in ranks 8 deep, their spears angled forward at precisely calculated intervals to create an impenetrable hedge of points. The front rank kneels with spear butts braced against the ground. The second rank stands with weapons leveled, and the ranks behind hold their pikes at steep angles to catch any cavalry that breaks through the initial barrier. But the true innovation lies not in the formation itself, which Scottish armies have used before, but in Bruce's training regimen that has taught these men to fight as professionals rather than militia. For months, Bruce's captains have drilled their companies in precise movement, teaching them to advance in step, to maintain spacing under pressure, and most crucially, to trust the man beside them completely. When an English knight charges toward a schiltron, every spear point must remain steady. Every man must hold his ground, because a single gap in the wall means death for everyone. This is not the wild courage of Highland warriors charging with claymore and targe. This is the cold discipline of men who understand that survival depends on mathematical precision and absolute faith in their training. The question that haunts the Scottish camp as Edward's banners approach is whether this discipline will hold when 2,500 armored knights come thundering toward their thin line of steel, and whether Bruce's gamble on terrain and training can overcome the simple arithmetic of being outnumbered more than 3-1. Dawn breaks on June 23rd with the kind of clarity that makes every banner visible for miles. Edward's vanguard crests the hill overlooking the Bannockburn to find something no English commander expects to see. The Scottish army drawn up in battle formation, waiting. Not fleeing toward Highland strongholds, not melting away into morning mist, but standing firm on ground they have chosen to defend. The Earl of Gloucester reins in his destrier and studies the Scottish positions through eyes trained by decades of continental warfare. What he sees should reassure him: 6,000 men arranged in tight squares on marshy ground, with their backs towards Stirling Castle and no apparent line of retreat. By every rule of medieval tactics, this represents Scottish desperation rather than Scottish strategy. Yet something in the stillness of those formations, the precise spacing of their ranks, suggests that Bruce's army has not gathered here to die gloriously but to fight methodically. Then Henry de Bohun sees an opportunity that will either win the battle in its opening moments or demonstrate why individual heroism cannot substitute for tactical wisdom. The young English knight recognizes Robert the Bruce riding ahead of his formations, armed only with a battle axe and mounted on a small Highland palfrey rather than a war horse. Here is the Spider King himself, within charging distance, apparently vulnerable and certainly symbolic. De Bohun lowers his lance, spurs his destrier, and thunders across the boggy ground toward personal glory and English victory. What happens next lasts perhaps 10 seconds, but echoes through 7 centuries of Scottish memory. Bruce watches the heavy cavalry charge approach, calculates angles and timing with the precision of a man who has survived 7 years by never making careless mistakes, then guides his nimble palfrey aside at the last possible moment. De Bohun's lance point passes harmlessly through empty air while Bruce's battle axe comes down with the full force of a man fighting for his kingdom's survival. The blade cleaves through the English, knight's helmet and skull, dropping him dead from his saddle before his own momentum carries his riderless horse into the Scottish ranks. The psychological impact of this single combat reverberates across both armies like thunder rolling through summer air. English knights who expected to scatter peasant levies instead witness their king fighting as a common soldier, risking personal death rather than commanding from safety. Scottish spearmen who might have wavered before English heavy cavalry see their leader strike down a knight in single combat, proving that English steel can be broken by Scottish resolve. But Bruce's captains worry that their king has risked everything for a moment of theater. What if de Bohun's lance had found its mark? What if Bruce's palfrey had stumbled in the soft ground? The Spider King has won the first exchange, but he has also announced that this battle will be decided by personal courage rather than tactical calculation, and English courage has conquered most of the known world. Night falls with English confidence intact, but English options narrowing. Edward II faces terrain that refuses to cooperate with his battle plans, and a Scottish army that will not retreat into convenient slaughter. The direct route to Stirling Castle lies blocked by Bruce's schiltrons, but the marshy ground to the east offers what appears to be a flanking opportunity. English scouts report that the bog can be crossed if the cavalry moves in single file along the firmer strips of earth that wind between the deeper pools. This is the moment when Edward's numerical advantage begins its transformation into tactical catastrophe. 20,000 men require space to deploy, room to maneuver, and firm ground to support the weight of heavy cavalry charges. The narrow causeway that threads through the bog can accommodate perhaps 3 knights riding abreast, which means that Edward's overwhelming force must squeeze through a bottleneck that reduces his effective strength to whatever can fit on a few yards of solid ground. But the English king has spent his entire reign avoiding difficult decisions, and this morning presents him with a choice that will define his legacy. He can withdraw his army, abandon the relief of Stirling Castle, and accept that Scotland will remain in Scottish hands. Or he can commit his forces to crossing treacherous ground that will strip away every advantage his superior numbers provide. Edward chooses to advance because retreat means acknowledging that a fugitive who once hid in caves has outmaneuvered the master of the richest kingdom in northern Europe. The crossing begins before dawn on June 24th, with the confidence of men who have never known defeat and the carelessness of commanders who mistake tactical complexity for cowardice. English heavy cavalry splash into the Bannockburn in columns that stretch back toward the horizon, their destriers' hooves finding purchase on ground that feels solid enough to support an army. Behind them march Welsh archers, Gascon crossbowmen, and English infantry, all funneling into a landscape that grows more treacherous with each step forward. Then the trap springs with the inexorable logic of physics and geography. Summer rains have turned the bog into a maze of hidden pools, connected by streams that look shallow but run deeper than a horse's belly. Knights who rode confidently across firm ground find their destriers stumbling into water that reaches their stirrups, then their saddles, then forces them to dismount and struggle forward on foot through mud that grips like wet cement. The neat formations that English doctrine requires dissolve into chaos as heavily armored men sink to their knees in ground that cannot support their weight. Worse than the bog itself is what the bog does to English command and control. Cavalry charges require coordination, archery needs clear fields of fire, and infantry formations demand room to deploy. None of these tactical necessities can function when an army finds itself strung out in single file across miles of treacherous terrain, each unit isolated from the others by ground that permits no lateral movement. Edward's war machine has transformed itself into a procession of individual targets, each struggling through the marsh without support from the men behind them, or knowledge of what lies ahead. The question that haunts the English vanguard as they flounder through the deepening bog is whether they are crossing difficult terrain toward eventual victory, or whether they have marched into a killing ground designed by a king who understands that the strongest armies can be destroyed by the simplest traps when pride prevents them from recognizing danger until escape becomes impossible. Dawn reveals the full scope of English disaster. Edward's vanguard struggles through the bog in broken columns while his main force crowds the causeway behind them, unable to deploy into battle formation on ground that offers no room for maneuver. This is the moment Robert the Bruce has prepared for through months of drilling and planning, when superior numbers become a liability and disciplined formations become the decisive weapon. The Scottish Schiltrons begin their advance with the measured pace of men who have rehearsed this movement 1,000 times. First, the horns sound from the Scottish positions, their harsh notes carrying across the marsh like the cry of hunting wolves. Next, the formations wheel into line, each square of 1,500 spearmen, moving as a single organism with 12-foot pikes lowered and angled forward. Finally, the advance begins, not with the wild charge of Highland warriors, but with the methodical step of professional soldiers who understand that victory belongs to the army that maintains formation while the enemy dissolves into chaos. English knights trapped in the bog face a tactical nightmare that their training has never prepared them to solve. Heavy. Cavalry depends on momentum and shock, but there can be no thundering charge when horses sink to their bellies in mud, and riders must dismount to avoid drowning in pools disguised as shallow streams. Archers require clear fields of fire and stable ground for accurate shooting, but the Welsh longbowmen find themselves scattered across miles of uncertain terrain with no way to concentrate their volleys where they might break Scottish formations. The Schiltrons press forward with relentless precision, their spear points creating walls of steel that advance yard by yard across firm ground, while English resistance crumbles in the marsh. Each Scottish formation maintains perfect spacing and alignment, the front ranks with pikes braced and ready, the rear ranks prepared to step forward when their comrades fall. This is not the desperate courage of men fighting for survival. This is the cold confidence of professionals executing a plan that accounts for every variable except English pride. Individual English knights attempt heroic charges that might have broken Scottish lines in previous campaigns. But heroism cannot overcome physics when heavy horses flounder in soft ground and isolated riders face disciplined formations designed to kill cavalry. Sir Giles d'Argenton, veteran of crusades and tournaments, spurs his destrier toward the nearest Scottish square only to watch his charge lose momentum in the bog, while dozens of spear points converge on his position. Even the finest knight in Christendom cannot defeat 1,500 men when terrain strips away every advantage that armor and training provide. The psychological collapse begins before the physical destruction reaches its climax. English soldiers who expected to sweep aside Scottish rabble instead witness their own army dissolving into individual struggles for survival, while enemy formations advance with machine-like coordination. Knights who have never known defeat find themselves trapped in mud, surrounded by enemies, and abandoned by comrades who cannot reach them across ground that permits no organized resistance. The question that drives panic through English ranks is whether any force can escape when retreat means crossing the same treacherous bog that has already destroyed their ability to fight, and whether an army that entered Scotland as conquerors can survive long enough to flee as refugees. The moment comes with quiet recognition that courage cannot overcome mathematics when an army fights the wrong battle on the wrong ground. Edward II watches his vanguard disintegrate in the bog, while his main force presses forward into the same trap, each unit adding to chaos rather than bringing relief. This is no longer a contest between English might and Scottish determination. This has become a struggle between organized formations and individual survival. The Earl of Gloucester makes the decision that transforms tactical defeat into strategic catastrophe. Rather than extracting his scattered knights through careful withdrawal, he orders a general advance that commits every remaining English reserve to the treacherous ground that has already destroyed the vanguard. 20,000 men surge forward into terrain that can support perhaps 3,000 in fighting formation, their overwhelming numbers becoming the mechanism of their own destruction. Scottish spears find English flesh with mechanical efficiency. The Schiltrons no longer need to advance, they need only hold positions and kill whatever struggles within reach of their pikes. Knights who have dominated European battlefields for generations die in Scottish mud, their expensive armor dragging them down, their trained destriers becoming liabilities in killing grounds where mobility means death. Edward himself faces the choice that will define his reign. He can die heroically attempting to rally forces that no longer exist as coherent units, or accept that survival requires abandoning the field to men who fight more intelligently than bravely. The king chooses flight across terrain that offers no easy escape routes and pursuit by enemies who know every stream and bog pool between Bannockburn and the English border. The retreat becomes a rout as English discipline collapses under tactical impossibility. Men throw away weapons and armor to move faster through the marsh, abandoning the tools of war that made them invincible in favor of speed that might keep them alive. Knights who rode north as conquerors flee south as refugees, their progress marked by discarded shields, abandoned banners, and bodies of comrades who could not match the pace required for survival. Scottish light cavalry and Highland infantry harry the English withdrawal, striking at isolated groups and cutting down stragglers while avoiding direct confrontation with formed units that might still possess defensive strength. This is the methodical destruction of a broken army by forces that understand how to turn victory into lasting strategic advantage. The question haunting every English survivor struggling toward the border is whether this defeat represents a temporary setback that superior resources can remedy, or whether something fundamental has shifted in the balance between nations. Something that cannot be restored through gold or reinforcements or royal proclamations of renewed war. Silence settles over the bog with the weight of history made flesh. Where 20,000 English voices had thundered across the marsh at dawn, only Scottish horns sound across fields littered with medieval warfare's most complete disaster. The Bannockburn runs red with more than water, carrying blood of knights whose grandfathers conquered Wales and whose sons will never ride to war. Victory has arrived as promised, but it limps across the battlefield, leaning heavily on loss. Robert the Bruce walks among the carnage with the measured pace of a king who understands that triumph and tragedy share the same ground. English dead lie thick in the marsh, their expensive armor now serving as tombstones rather than protection. But Scottish bodies rest beside them, men who followed their king's gamble with their lives and paid the price that even perfect tactics cannot eliminate entirely. The harvest of victory yields wealth that transforms Scotland from rebellious province into a kingdom capable of financing its own defense. English nobles captured in the bog represent ransoms worth more than most Scottish castles, their gold buying weapons and supplies that will secure Bruce's revolution for generations. The Earl of Hereford alone is worth enough silver to equip 1,000 Scottish spearmen. Among the English dead lies Sir Giles d'Argenton, the knight whose reputation stretched from Scottish borders to the gates of Jerusalem. His body proof that individual excellence cannot overcome collective discipline when terrain strips away every advantage. His death marks the end of an era when personal prowess could decide the fate of armies, and the birth of a new age when professional formations matter more than heroic gestures. England has lost more than soldiers. It has lost the myth of invincibility that made English demands seem like natural law rather than royal ambition. Edward II flees south with remnants of the largest army England has ever assembled, carrying news that will reshape every political calculation from the Scottish Highlands to the French court. Scotland, too, pays a price for victory that gold cannot measure. The kingdom that emerges from Bannockburn carries scars that will never fully heal. The knowledge that independence requires eternal vigilance and willingness to sacrifice everything when survival demands it. Every Scottish family has lost sons to the bog, their blood the foundation upon which Bruce builds his throne. The impossible victory becomes inevitable truth when measured against the patient work of years, rather than the drama of a single day. 6,000 Scots did not defeat 20,000 English through miraculous intervention or supernatural favor. They achieved victory through the methodical application of terrain knowledge, tactical discipline, and strategic patience that transformed English strength into English weakness. Robert the Bruce's web had taken 7 years to weave, but at Bannockburn it caught prey worthy of the Spider King's reputation. Scotland emerges from the bog as something England has never faced before. A kingdom that cannot be conquered because its people have learned that survival requires fighting, smarter rather than harder. The feudal levies that English cavalry had scattered at Falkirk have become professional formations capable of destroying the finest knights in Europe through coordinated effort rather than individual heroism. This transformation represents more than military evolution. It marks the birth of a nation that understands its own capabilities and limitations with deadly precision. Edward II's claims of overlordship die in the marsh alongside his knights, their legal foundations as waterlogged as the ground that swallowed his army. No English king can demand homage from a realm that has proven its independence through superior warfare. No papal bull can restore authority that Scottish spears have shattered. No diplomatic negotiation can undo the demonstration that English power has limits that Scottish determination can exploit. Bruce is no longer a rebel fighting for recognition. He is a king whose sovereignty has been written in English blood on Scottish soil. The strategic consequences ripple across Europe like stones thrown into still water. French diplomats who once treated Scotland as an English appendage now recognize Bruce's kingdom as a potential ally against Plantagenet ambitions. Welsh princes who had accepted English dominance as permanent fact begin calculating whether Scottish success might be replicated in their own mountains. Irish chieftains watch English weakness with renewed interest, wondering if the tide that turned at Bannockburn might flow westward across the Irish Sea. But the deepest victory lies not in diplomatic recognition or military reputation, but in the transformation of Scottish identity itself. The men who fought in the Schiltrons return to their homes as veterans of an impossible triumph, carrying stories that will reshape how Scotland sees itself for generations. They have proven that English knights are not invincible, that English gold cannot purchase victory, that English threats carry no weight when Scottish courage is married to Scottish intelligence. This was never a story of miraculous reversal or divine intervention. This became a story of how preparation defeats improvisation, how discipline conquers numbers, how terrain knowledge trumps tactical doctrine, and how a kingdom willing to fight intelligently can defeat an empire that fights only conventionally. The Spider King's web is complete, and Scotland will never again be prey for English ambition. 7 centuries later, the name Bannockburn still carries the weight of impossibility made real. The marshy ground where 6,000 disciplined Scots destroyed 20,000 English invaders has become sacred soil in the Scottish imagination. But the battle's true legacy lives in the enduring lesson that small nations can defeat empires when intelligence replaces desperation and preparation conquers improvisation. The declaration of Arbroath follows Bannockburn by 6 years, its famous words echoing the spirit that triumphed in the bog. When Scottish nobles write that they fight not for glory or riches but for freedom alone, they speak as men who have proven that such freedom can be won and held against overwhelming odds. The declaration's defiance carries the confidence of warriors who watched English supremacy die in Scottish mud. Robert the Bruce's lesson transcends his own age and kingdom. The Spider King's patient, Web weaving becomes a template for asymmetric warfare that echoes through centuries of conflict between the strong and the determined. From Vietnamese jungles to Afghan mountains, the principles proven at Bannockburn resurface wherever outnumbered defenders discover that terrain and training matter more than numbers and technology. The cultural remnant persists in every Scottish heart that quickens when bagpipes sound, or tartan flies in Highland wind. Children learn the story of Bruce and the Spider, the tale of persistence rewarded, but the deeper inheritance lies in the knowledge that Scotland earned its independence through the methodical application of military science to political necessity. This is why Bannockburn endures while other medieval battles fade into footnotes, because it proved that David can defeat Goliath when David chooses the ground. The final echo carries a warning that empires ignore at their peril. English confidence in overwhelming force led 20,000 professional soldiers into a trap that 6,000 part-time warriors had prepared with deadly patience. The strongest armies remain vulnerable when led by commanders who confuse resources with wisdom. Today, when tourists visit the battlefield, they walk on ground that witnessed the birth of a truth older than nations. That courage without intelligence is merely waste, but courage guided by preparation can topple thrones and shatter empires. The Bannockburn still flows toward the sea, but on June 24th, 1414, it carried something more precious toward history, the proof that freedom belongs to those willing to fight intelligently for it.